So good morning. I think we can begin with our class today. Welcome to our today's session of our class, Europeanization Processes in Southeastern Europe. I'm very glad to present our colleague at the Center for Southeast European Studies, Dorian Jano, who is a Marie Skłodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellow at the center from Tirana. And he will be talking about Europeanization of public policies, EU compliance in the countries of Southeastern Europe. So we're shifting from a discussion last week we had on everyday Europeanization to the way it works in certain way more on an institutional level and in terms of policy, government and policy and institutions. So with that, I'll give the floor to Dorian for his presentation. And as usual, I ask all the participants to keep their cameras and microphones off until the end, when of course we're having our conversation, and you can ask questions regarding the presentation. Then of course you're very welcome to not just put your questions in the chat, but also to ask them in person. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dorian. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Florian. Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to talk to you today about the issues of how the countries from the Southeast Europe have dealt with EU accession. So my talk will be focused in two main parts. I will try to give an overview of the current situation of the countries from the Western Balkans and how they are complying with EU acquis. It has been now more than 20 years, so this is a huge amount of time, so that we could see if and to what extent the countries of the region are complying with EU acquis. But this as a general overview, and then the second point that I want to discuss is to look at some specific policy sectors. Given the complexity of the issue, we could make some kind of generalization, but yet the issue rests on the policies, on the policy area. So having said that, I would like to make a general introduction on the concept of Europeanization and the types of transformation that we are dealing in the region, especially after the fall of the communism in the 90s. So if one wants to study the region, we know that it is very complex in terms of the transformative processes that the region is going through. I mean, just to get the first example after the 90s with the dissolution of ex-Yugoslavia, most of the region was going under not only a state building, but also dealing with issues of nation-state building. The war in Bosnia and then Kosovo, but also Albania, which underwent a very problematic issue in 97. So that's why sometimes this beginning of the post-communist area could be called as a type of Balkanization again in the region. Besides that, we don't have to forget that the region was having the transition from a communist socialist regime to a democratic regime. So we have a lot of issues to deal here with institution building. So how to build institutions that are democratic and could function for the system that we want to look at. But it was in 99 when the region got also the perspective of joining the EU. And from that period, there is a huge literature that studies this transformation in the region through the concept of Europeanization. So that will be the focus of my today's speech. So I will try to look at how the state of the Western Balkans are dealing with adaptation of rather institutionally or policy issues to come to what we can call here a member state building. So it's not just building institutions that are democratic or institutions for a functional economy, but we need to have institutions that resembles those of the EU or of the member state countries. And here the most important also theoretical aspect have been the concept of EU compliance and EU conditionality. I will talk a little bit on this aspect, but also not focusing mainly on EU conditionality, but also on other models of how EU or European and European states can influence the countries of the region, given that we need to look also on the domestic situation of the region. So pretty much the discussion will be to see the transformation that is happening in the region after 2000. So around 20 years of analysis. So the first issue that I want to deal is with Europeanization as a concept, which really has been now a word that has been used very much. And sometimes there is a problem of how well we can define this concept. So in very general terms, and if we consider only, let's say, the area of politics, Europeanization have been considered as everything that has to do with transformations and changes that come rather by EU integration, and in our case of the Western Balkans because of the EU enlargement process, or in a more general terms, but whatever it is supposed to be of Europe. So such definitions have two components that include in themselves. First regards that Europeanization is a process, and rather we can define it in a more strict way or in a more broader way. And also what it includes in it is that Europeanization sometimes has been seen also as an end result. So the result of all this process. So if we want to look at the very narrow concept of Europeanization, it's nothing else rather than the responses to EU policies. So what countries do compared to EU acquis and EU policies. While in a very general terms, everything that is supposed to be affected in the political system of a country, that's supposed to be something Europeanized. There is something that is very different on the general Europeanization literature that regards only the candidate countries, meaning that the effects of this process are what we call anticipatory and anticipated, meaning that we are studying this process because those countries are being prepared to be in a future member states, but also we study this because that will be also influencing the post-membership membership status of those countries. So in some words, we can say that, especially for the candidate countries, the impact of the EU enlargement process is what Europeanization could mean in the political sense of the issue. Now, because I want to focus more on the policy issue rather than on, let's say, politics, political parties or state issues, I want to bring here the definition by Radaeli, which is very much used, especially in comparative policy analysis, and because it defines very well the whole process of Europeanization. So what Radaeli is saying is that Europeanization should be considered a process of construction, diffusion, and institutionalization of formal and informal rules, of procedures, of policy paradigms, styles, ways of doing things, share of beliefs and norms. So this component is very important to give the overall elements of a policy analysis. And of course, here the definition is much more broad also for European EU studies. So some questions that we need to have in mind before undertaking a research on Europeanization. So first we need to know what we are studying as or being Europeanized, and at what extent or how much of Europeanization we could expect. So when we discuss for the domains of Europeanization, so where Europeanization is taking place, there are two directions that somebody could take. First is trying to see what effects do we have in the policy level, what effects do we have in the way of constructing the state, like polity sphere component of politics, and also in politics. So we could study political party, what happens with public opinion, interest group, and all these issues. But Radaeli sometimes bring a more overarching analysis and saying that, yes, we could also measure or study Europeanization if we consider both policies and institutions. I mean, this is what I will try to focus more, although I will give some ideas regarding politics and polity in the countries of Southeastern Europe. Then another thing that we need to consider is the aspects of this type of Europeanization. So what forms of Europeanization we can expect? There are usually three forms of Europeanization. So the so-called discursive Europeanization. So we try to see on statement, communicating statement that policymakers are doing, or how the discourse is on public opinion. The second aspect regards the formality of the Europeanization. So this pretty much regards the adaptation of legislation or any policy that is conform to EU requirement. And the more difficult sometimes aspect of Europeanization has been the behavior one. And if we want to put it in the context of public policy, this is nothing else but like the implementation and how those states are applying the policies that they are adopting. Another issue that we need to consider when we study Europeanization of the policies regards the degree of Europeanization. So how much or how likely it is that something become Europeanized. So here sometimes we make a scale, so we could talk of partial Europeanization, we could talk of full Europeanization, we could talk of high or low degree of Europeanization. And another very important aspect regards the direction of Europeanization, meaning if the impact that we are expecting is positive, or if the impact of EU and European integration may have a negative direction. So now I will try to briefly look a little bit on the first two components, on the polity and on politics, so then to move further on the study of public policy in the Southeast Europe. So, of course, we could talk for Europeanization of the polity, so the way how state structure and the basic principles that the countries from Southeast Europe have adopted because of the EU integration. So there are some issues that I have brought here, but if we want, we can discuss it further. The first and the most important regards the check and balance. So the process of European integration has brought a changing of the balance of power between the executive, the legislative. The more obvious one is that the governments of those countries have been empowered over the parliaments. And this is because of the direct contact that and the responsibility of the EU integration process regards on or stands on EU governments more than any other institution. Lately, there have been some attempts, to re-enter the parliaments on this process, but still it is only on some, let's say, European meetings, between the Euro deputies and also the parliamentarians from the region. But still the power rests on the government. And I mean, the governments have, for whatever reforms that they are doing, they are using this European integration as an excuse for every reforms that they want to implement in the countries. But even within the executive, what we see is let's say, a kind of restructuring of those governments. Many of the countries from Southeast Europe have adopted a ministry that was not before the so-called Ministries of European Integration, which are the leading, let's say, the leading agency in the government, since all those countries from the region are willing to join the European Union. So pretty much the agenda setting comes from the Ministries of European Integration, or in other cases, countries have introduced a kind of agency under the umbrella of the Prime Minister. And the countries that are negotiating today EU accession have formed a group which negotiates with the EU, and of course the power of the executive in a way rests on these institutions. Also, we can see some very important impacts of the process regarding the judiciary. And here I am bringing two examples, the Croatian one, which did a thorough reform of the judiciary system, and it was successful. I mean, one of the major positive impacts why Croatia proceeded so fast with the integration process regards also the judiciary reform. The same, it has been applied in Albania, where like there have been constitutional change and all this so-called judiciary and rule of law reform, which for the moment we can discuss for what may have been some of the feedbacks. But the process of EU enlargement also have impacts on the state identity issues of the countries. So just to bring the example of the changing of the name of North Macedonia in 2019. So this is a very huge impact that came out as a result of the Europeanization process in a way, or the Serbia and the Kosovo dialogue. So two countries going out of war, but still we can see them that they are trying to establish a dialogue through the EU as the main interlocutor. So there are a number of issues that we can discuss of how European integration process is bringing results and impact on the very way of the structure of the state institutions and principles of those countries. But this is not the only one. We have the second component that regards politics. Even here we could see the impact of the Europeanization process. Let me start first with the public opinions and the elite of this country. So in general, we could say, or if we compare to the Eurobarometer data from the member states, state that the region in general is not Eurosceptic in the sense that public is very willing to join the EU, or at least they are not that like the majority is not that against. Although this leaves a discussion and to see how the issue has developed lately, or there is also differences within the countries. For example, we have Serbia and Bosnia, which are more Eurosceptic rather than Albania, let's say, or Kosovo, which are the more Euro enthusiastic. There is also some impact on the interest groups of this country. And here what it has been seen is that the civil society is, let's say, more Eurosceptic, but also the business association. So this kind of interest group has a positive attitude towards EU integration, and a lot of them, like the civil society mostly, but also the business association, have established contacts with the institutions or other European-wide organization or association. So this is a direct impact that the process is bringing to this kind of interest groups. Then we could see also an impact of the process to the political parties. So in general, most of the political parties, or at least the major political parties in the region, are supportive of the EU integration process. Lately, what it has been evidence is that yes, there are some small parties that are showing some tendencies of nationalism, or let's say against the liberal, neoliberal democracy idea, but still we could say that they are more towards this kind of being against rather than being, let's say, anti-EU as a priori. So they are not against the EU, but let's say on the some of the main pillars that the EU is built, like the liberal democracy. So still, even here, we need to see that there is an impact. But if we make a comparison, for sure that let's say if we can find less impact, especially on the polity component, and also on the politics, for sure, the Europeanization effects in public policies is much more evident. And said that, we should not forget that at least two countries now, Serbia and Montenegro, are on the process of complying with EU acquis, so the whole legislations of the EU. So this is, and they have progressed, we could say, well on this issue. North Macedonia and Albania are waiting for that start of the intergovernmental organization, so they will be on the process of trying to comply with all EU acquis. And for sure, Bosnia and Kosovo, which are a little bit behind the process, they are still engaged with adaptation of the EU policies. And as I said, beside the general point of view, what has been noticed is that type of policy matters, meaning that the type of results that we see, the mechanism that function are not the same for each of the policy sectors. So we will look a little bit in detail of some of those policies and how they have developed. I just wanted to point here that also the new methodology of the EU Commission now are making this kind of grouping of the chapters, or what they call the cluster. So that could be also a point to discuss of what influences it may have in the whole process. As I see it now, it seems that we will have much more integrational policy with this clustering rather than the final results of EU membership. So how now we could measure Europeanization, or how we could measure compliance with EU acquis. Most of the studies usually refer to what they have been called progress reports, or after 2015 they are called the country reports. I think this is a good base for getting information. Firstly, because they are information that they are gathered on a yearly basis. Secondly, it is because this is systematic, so meaning that EU Commission has pretty much used the same methodology, although, for example, in 2015, the methodology changed a little bit by introducing also the component of regressions. So in general, this is a good continuous systematic methodology besides some elements that could have been added. So the reports are considered to be very comprehensive on the way of how they analyze the reforms on the country. This is because they gather the information from a lot of resources. So it's not only the Commission, they get information also from the member states, also from the government of the countries that they are trying to include the report, of civil society. So there are a lot of information coming from a number of resources. And the other issue why those reports are good reference is because they try to see the reforms not only on let's say adaptation of laws or certain formal policies that the government introduced, but they try to see also institutional change that go along with this, and also like lately the emphasis is put also on track records. So a way of trying to see how the behavior may have changed in a certain sector. So in the paper that I'm referring to, I try to use the kind of qualitative assessment that the reports do. And if we see it, I said like before, when they were called country report, we could find the 4-scale evaluation. So the Commission was evaluating the reform or a sector if there have been progress on that. So rather on adapting a new law or making a new institutional change, or if there have been some let's say aspect of behavioral change or track record. So this could be one issue that or one evaluation. So if there is no progress in this sector, the second value could be if there is, some progress, or usually they say little, limited. So all of this could be considered as one indicator. Reforms could have progress, and that's like what it is supposed to be or expected. And the best scenario will be when the reports evaluate the sector as having done significant or very good progress. So this is the fourth scale that I'm using. I said that after 2015, the report introduced also like not only there have been no progress on that sector, but they could evaluate also as this the regress that the sector could be. So in this case, it could be a 5 scale evaluation. So after, let's say, taking all the chapters and all the policy issue evaluated on this scale, I try to make a kind of an index of compliance with this, with EU acquis, trying to make the average for each country for each year, having the total sum of the evaluation with this 4 scale, and then dividing by the total number of policy area that have been evaluated, which pretty much is all the policy sector in those countries. So that's why these reports are very very detailed, and it could be considered as a scan of all the policy areas in this country. So this is some of the results that I am showing for each of the countries of Southeast Europe. So the first issue that we could say is that we have a total variation, not only not only between the countries of Southeast Europe, but also within the countries, within a country from Southeast Europe. Instead, this is a very different picture of what we have seen in the previous EU enlargement from the Central Eastern Europe. But what we can consider here, firstly, is let's look at the case of Croatia, which I have made it as a separate slide. This is to show that how Croatia did manage in let's say, a 10-year period of time to succeed on EU integration, and that's how Croatia have complied with all of the EU acquis. There are some important elements here that we could point, and I mean, it's the same has been also noted in the accession of the countries from Southeast or from Central Eastern Europe. So if we see there is a slight decline on compliance with the EU acquis, and this comes after Croatia got the perspective that she will join in 2012. So this is pretty much the same trend that happened also for Central Eastern European countries. And the second important issue is that, as we see it also in Croatia, the country do not or are not expected to fully align with EU acquis. So there is a certain degree of, things that could be done and arranged after the countries become member states. So moving from the, let's say, the best scenario, as was that of Croatia, then we have the other countries which for sure are not on the same, let's say, progress towards EU accession. We have Montenegro and Serbia, which, if we see, for example, Serbia has been complying well during the first years, but there is a decline during the last years. I mean, this type of declining of compliance with EU could be seen in all countries except Montenegro. Montenegro seems to keep still the rhythm of reforms and complying with EU acquis. North Macedonia is also a very specific case. It started, let's say, the same year or 1 year before Croatia, and I mean, North Macedonia was doing well. But if we see after 2011, there is a decrease on the progress that the country was doing toward meeting EU requirements. Kosovo and Bosnia face some difficulties on complying with EU, but this is also because they are not yet candidate countries, so their focus is much more on compliance with EU democracy and market economy rather than the EU acquis, which is more a demand for the countries that have already opened accession negotiation. So as I said here, we could see and discuss for countries as being laggard or front runner on the EU compliance performance. Croatia could be taken as the sample case for those countries, so trying to see what they need to do and how to keep the rhythm of the reforms, and also a case that once the date of accession is set, that we see that the countries relax a little bit on the way of complying strictly with EU acquis. So in general, with the exception of Croatia, we could see that those countries achieve only partial compliance. And there have been only instances where countries were doing well for a year or two, having some very good progress on compliance. The only exception here could be Montenegro, which still is keeping its rhythm also of lower compliance level, but still it has some good result even after 2015. And I think this is an important year that we could discuss later, because that's also the Juncker Declaration, where those countries have to accept. So it's all the way of trying to say to those countries that yes, you are not yet ready, or the integration process will not stop, but at least will be postponed. So this is a kind of negative message given to those countries. There has been also a study of trying to see, given those parameters that those countries of Southeast Europe were having, to see what will be, let's say, a feasible date that the countries from the region get this threshold of Croatia signing the accession treaty, or the countries from Central Europe. So if we see pretty much the horizontal line shows this threshold, which numerically is shown as 0.7, but we could say that it's not the full compliance, but some good compliance need to be done. And the dashed line, it's given the progress that those countries has done for years, to see if the same conditions will rest, how those countries will, when those countries will achieve the threshold. And the studies show that only Macedonia, North Macedonia and Serbia could have been ready before 2030. And I think that forecast now perhaps do not rest that much, considering a number of issues that have happened. COVID also is a situation that has put aside the compliance or issue, but countries are dealing with other issues. Still, this I brought because it's very important to see, like other countries as Albania or Bosnia or Turkey or Macedonia or Kosovo, seem to have a very long forecast of when they may let's say be ready to join, but then we need to consider other political factors. But just considering the way or the progress that they are doing to comply with EU, it seems that the process will take much more longer than it is expected. In this slide, I try to make a comparison of the enlargement rounds. So if we see the progress that the countries of Central Eastern Europe has done, it's a very sharp progress. They have done it within 10 years. They managed to achieve the progress needed in compliance with the EU acquis. While the other graph, the black line, shows the progress that the countries of the region are doing. And here, the one important issue is that the process is taking so long. So we are still 20 years after the perspective of enlargement, and those countries are still resting on, let's say, a very minimal level, and not considering also a kind of regress they are doing. So now, beside this situation, I will try to talk a little bit of how we could understand why those countries of the region are performing this way. So the theoretical framework is a little bit complicated. I'm just trying to give it with a sentence. So if we want to see the domestic effect and changes in those countries, we have to consider either EU membership conditionality, persuasion of the governments, or the type of socialization of the domestic actors. And yet we need to keep in mind also the restrictions that come by domestic conditionalities, conditions or historical legacies of those countries. There is, in fact, 3 very detailed models that have been developed, and perhaps I could go a little bit fast on that. So the first one regards what has been called as external incentive model, so Europeanization through conditionality. So here, so the Europeanization could come as a kind of rationalist logic. It is done through the intergovernmental meetings where EU enforce in a way EU conditions, and on the other way gives some incentives to those countries. So this model pretty much is based on institutional changes. So there are some factors that we need to consider rather at the European level, as it may be EU membership credibility. If the conditions are very fine-tuned, there is a number of conditions on a specific field, and also if there are accompanied by some financial aid, since those reforms need resources. While at the domestic level, usually we need to consider that there are no major political constraints or veto players, so some actors that could stop the reforms, and for sure the reform for those countries should not have costs, not only on financial sense, but also like political costs. Usually the outcome that we expect by this model of Europeanization is a formal one. So kind of adaptations of policies and legislation. The other vertical and EU-driven Europeanization is through persuasion of the domestic actors through normative power. So in this sense, EU, what it tries to do is to empower actors that are pro-European. This is, we say, less direct in the sense that there is nothing written or as a kind of intergovernmental meeting on that. So here, the most important issue at the European level, it's the legitimacy that the EU have for the domestic actors. And at the domestic level, for sure, the governments should resonate the type of policies that the EU is doing and identify themselves with them rather than with other actors. In fact, this type of modeling of Europeanization has an expectation more for changing on the behavior rather than on the formal aspects. But there is not only the top-down approach or let's say a bottom-out approach where the governments from the Southeast Europe take these initiatives. There have been also a third model, called Europeanization through socialization. And this is more of a cross-loading where actors are, let's say, on the same type of hierarchy. And what this, let's say, transnational or social networking are doing is that they frame those actors to have a certain type of idea about the change. At the domestic level, usually we need to look at what has been called epistemic communities or simply, trans-European networks or programs of a certain policy sectors. While at the domestic level, what we need to look is how if the domestic policies, domestic actors are dissatisfied with the results of a certain policy area, so they have the will to change. And if the rules that we are taking rather from the member state country or from other trans-European networks is transferable to the domestic countries. Usually this kind of modeling of Europeanization is pretty much looking at the discourse impact, so that people perhaps will not change a policy area, will not build an institution or have a policy a behavior impact, but at least at the communicative, at the discursive level, we could see this kind of impact. And this is like not a model, but still we need to consider that beside the three models that we are discussing, there may be resistance to Europe, and this comes from the domestic of those countries. It could be following the logic of path dependency, so there is something that is already has a legacy in the domestic actors, and that's why it persists and it's difficult to change. Here we don't have any factor to consider at the EU level, but at the domestic level, for sure, we need to consider the at least the institutional capacities like legal culture or the administrative capacity of a country for making a change. And here, for sure, we could see less of the three forms of Europeanization, so neither discursive nor formal or behavior. So having said a little bit this general picture or theoretical framework, I try to make a comparative analysis. I could talk in more detail later if we want to, but why I choose this method for analyzing my data. Firstly, because this is a very systematic examination, even when you deal with few cases, as it was my my study that I was dealing only with 7 countries. The method is also good because it involves theory and it contributes to theory, but at the same time it's very contextual. So it looks at very specific cases that you are interested in, this case, Southeastern European countries. And another important element of this method is that it studies what they call heterogeneity or equifinality, meaning that you can arrive in one type of output through different direction. And given the very complex theoretical framework, I think the combination of these factors was what I was looking for. So I'm just pointing my results of this study. So in terms of conditions that are necessary and sufficient for complying with EU acquis in Southeastern Europe. So for sure, we need to have low political constraint and the government should resonate with EU. So this is what should be in all type of Europeanization of public policies in the countries of Southeastern Europe. But is that enough? No. This is only something that has to be there, but it doesn't show that the compliance will in a way be sufficient. And for that, we need for sure the EU membership credibility. So EU membership credibility seems very important also in the countries of Southeast Europe when we talk about EU compliance. Now, the last issue that I want to discuss is taking some case studies for some policy areas. And this is because policy matters. So whatever we give as a general idea, or let's say if we know the forest, at least now we need to know the trees. So each of the policy sector has its own specificity on the way of Europeanization outcomes, mechanism, and factors that influence. I try to make a distinction between some sectors, so bringing a case study from what EU has considered as like political priority for the countries of Southeastern Europe, and this is justice reform and also the issue of migration and security, so home and justice affair of the EU. There is also some policy sectors which are very important to EU and have EU interests, as energy and environment. We could look also in some sectors where EU do not have EU conditions for themselves. And that's like social policy or education, where member state countries are, let's say, free on deciding on their own agenda. So trying to see what and how this reflects in Southeastern Europe. And there is also another type of policies where we could see that this is very like technical and new for the countries of Southeastern Europe, and this is the regional and cohesion policy. So let's start with justice and rule of law. So I'm bringing here some data from the world governance indicator to see how the countries of the region are doing. So what we can say in some few words is that for sure Croatia has done a very good progress on that. And also, if we consider the other countries as Albania or Serbia, we could say that given the start point, yes, for sure, they have done some progress throughout the years. So what we are noticing here is for each of the specific countries, but also like the general trend of the region is that there is a kind of deterioration of the rule of law, especially after 2014 on those countries. Here I mentioned that Croatia has been considered as a best practice case because the justice reform was quick and efficient. And I mean, was also as a reward for the country to join the EU. But is this only because of the EU incentives? Is it because the EU was very credible to giving the membership? The case of Croatia showed that it was also important because of the empowerment of the domestic ruling. I mean, the prime minister that was elected on that year, you know, was not a very high political figure, but I mean, she did everything to fight corruption, also to be, you know, a kind of credible actor, not only for the EU, but also for its own public opinion. So I think this is also a case where we need to see the importance of empowering some domestic actors that really wants to make the change. If we consider the migration and security issue, we could say in a few words that yes, this has been a very important issue for the EU. Sometimes it has been called as externalization of home and justice affairs from the EU side. And what was important in this case is that the EU was using the so-called policy conditionality. So the extra incentive giving to the countries of from Southeast Europe, if they comply with this policy, they will have the visa liberalization regime. And we see that all countries have complied with this policy sector just to have a kind of reward, which was visa liberalization regime. In the sector of energy, EU was trying to, in a way, replicate its own idea of cooperation in the energy sector for all the countries of Southeastern Europe, including here Bulgaria and Romania, with a multilateral treaty that they signed on 2005, and the EU is following the project, the progress, rather by giving financial assistance on also by the compliance with the acquis of the chapter 50. But what has been seen here is that there have been a low impact on this policy sector, and this is mainly because of the domestic opposition that has come rather from the NGO sector, environmental NGO sector, which are opposing the energy market liberalization because they see it as coming at the expense of the environmental area, but also opposition coming from domestic industries, and this is because of the let's say kind of legacies that have worked for this industry sector, which have been used to state ownership, subsidiarity, so not very pro towards kind of market liberalization. If we consider the environmental policy, this is a very expensive policy also for the region. So beside the progress that it has done, like a number of legislation that have been improved, or if the infrastructure in the region has been increased, or capacities of dealing with the sector, still the implementation, so the way how this policy, environmental policy, are enforced, it's not at the expected result, and this is because this type of policy, as I said, has a high financial cost. But still in this sector, we could say because of the this is not only an EU issue, but a number of international organizations are also engaged. This is a kind of policy learning issue for domestics. So the results that have been achieved could be attributed also to this kind of policy learning through other international organizations. With regards to education policy, what we see is that countries that are closer to join the EU comply best, and this is because they rather are part of the persuasion process, being on this network of policy dialogues or socialization, if they are part of technical cooperation meetings that they are done throughout the country. And for sure, another aspect of impact here is because of the financial incentives that the EU is offering here. There are a number of programs that are enforced, like Erasmus or previously the Tempus program. While if we see the social policy, of course, here there is a big competition between EU, which do not have a very fine EU condition and policy in this sector. And from the other side, the international donors such as World Bank, which has a very structural framework of policies such may be the pension system or social protection and health. So in this sector, we could say that because EU do not have any EU, let's say, strict condition to those countries, what we can notice here is only a kind of discursive Europeanization, where the country talks for social inclusion or protection of workers, but perhaps they are doing something else given the energy, the programs, and the financial assistance that they are using from other international organizations, such maybe World Bank in this case. And the last case study before we go to the discussion, I want to mention the regional and cohesion policy, which is something in a way new for those countries. And here we have the contradiction between decentralization. So this is not only making some statistical units, but also giving some independence to regions, to cities, and let's say the legacy of or the will of those countries to concentrate the power at the center, the power and the authority of doing things. So even here, what we can see is only few changes which like have been changed year after year, given that those countries are not yet member state countries. So there are new structure perhaps proposed, processes that go towards this kind of decentralization, but at the same time, the domestic actors are fully aware of trying not to give that much in the sense of giving power and total authority to institutions that work in a regional or local level. So the best that this policy has achieved is only some policy networks between different actors, from the central governments or the municipalities, which could change ideas and work for specific aspect of policy, but nothing more than that. So here I am coming not to some conclusion, but let's say some ideas which we can open the discussion further. It has been almost more than 2 decades that the countries of Southeastern Europe enter this process of EU integration, but the process is being very long. It has been even more unpredictable now, and the reward of membership seems very far away. So most of my idea is that perhaps we are going toward policy conditionality, meaning that we do, those countries do something on a specific sector, they get integrated, but that's what we remain, so we will not have this foreseen EU membership in the future. When we talk for compliance here, we need to also distinguish between adoption only of in papers and in law, but when it comes to implementation, the region is facing problems. And sometimes it is understandable because it is not only an issue of a political will, but you need to have also resources to fully and let's say implement those policies to have a certain results. Also, when we discuss for Europeanization, and now this will be like how we will see the issues. So there is one aspect that we could say, yes, there is progress that those countries are doing, especially if we're considering the starting point. But still, we could argue that this is like a very low performance. And I mean, if compared to the countries of Central Eastern Europe, for sure, we could argue that EU has failed to have its transformative power in the extent that it have in the region of Central Eastern Europe. So with this, I'd like to thank you and invite you for the further discussion. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dorian, for your overview, and I think also some interesting data to kind of back up these analyses. So I think now we can enter with our discussion.